You ever wonder how a quiet kid from Sicily learns to own the streets of New York? Let me tell ya, it ain't from Sunday school. It starts with a ship. A smell of salt water so thick it sticks in your clothes for weeks. The sound of coughing in the dark, babies crying, men swearing in Sicilian under their breath, clutching what little they got left from the old country. That was 1906, and the name on the manifest was Salvatore Lucania. My name. Back then, I was just another skinny kid with shoes too big for his feet and a family hoping America was the place where all the doors were open. Only the doors in the Lower East Side didn't open. They slammed in your face unless you had the muscle or the brains to make 'em open. Picture this: narrow streets, laundry lines like spider webs across the sky, pushcarts selling anything from apples to bootleg cigarettes. Every corner had its own rules. And the cops? They didn't care unless you had the right envelope in your pocket. My old man worked a job at a sulfur plant, coming home smelling like rotten eggs and sweat. My ma scrubbed floors. We ate, but we never ate enough. Kids like me, we learned quick. You wanna survive? You better figure out who's in charge of your block. And you better make yourself useful to 'em. I started running errands for the older boys, carrying packages, keeping lookout, passing notes that were never meant for the mailman. I didn't ask what was in the packages. You learn in the street, don't ask questions unless you want trouble. The older guys liked me. Said I was quick, didn't talk much, and didn't scare easy. That's the thing, if you look a man in the eye when you're just a kid, he starts thinking maybe you'll be somebody. One day, I got jumped by 3 kids from a rival street. They wanted to take the nickel I just earned. I fought back. Lost 2 teeth and split my lip open so bad I couldn't eat solid food for a week, but I didn't let go of that nickel. After that, people started calling me lucky. At first, it was just a joke, 'cause I got lucky surviving scraps like that. But I made it stick. Sometimes the name you take is more important than the name you're given. You gotta understand, this was before Prohibition, before all the big money. The street was the school. You learned numbers from keeping track of bets. You learned politics from watching who paid off which cop. And you learned loyalty from knowing which guy would stand with you in a fight, and which would disappear the second the knives came out. I had friends, some I'd know for life. Guys like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, though we were just kids then, hustling pennies at the pool halls. The Lower East Side at night was another world. Gas lamps barely lighting the alleys, the stink of horse manure mixed with roasting chestnuts, and music, always some kind of music, floating out of the saloons. You could walk past a synagogue, a Catholic church, and an Italian bakery all on the same block. Everyone had their own piece of the city, and they guarded it like treasure. It was around this time I started to realize something important: the real power wasn't the guy who could throw the hardest punch, it was the guy who could make other guys throw punches for him. The ones who knew how to talk, make deals, keep everyone making money. Even as a teenager, I watched how the bosses worked. They didn't waste time on street fights unless there was something to gain. They'd smile while they were cutting your throat, figuratively or otherwise. I remember one night in particular, winter, snow slush on the ground, my breath coming out in white clouds. I was delivering a small package for one of the older guys to a cigar shop on Mulberry Street. Inside, it was warm and smelled like tobacco. A man in a sharp suit took the package, looked at me, and said, "Kid, if you keep your mouth shut, you might live long enough to see the good life." I didn't know then, but that was the first time someone in the life had taken me seriously. Years later, I look back on those days and see them for what they were: training. You don't realize you're learning how to survive until you've already done it 100 times. You don't realize you're building a reputation until people start crossing the street when they see you coming. By the time I was in my late teens, the world outside was changing. The country was talking about something called Prohibition, making booze illegal. I didn't care much about politics, but I could see the older guys licking their lips like wolves. If the government took liquor off the shelves, it wasn't gonna stop people from drinking. It was just gonna mean somebody else was gonna sell it. and that somebody was gonna make a fortune. I wasn't a boss yet. I was just a kid with a sharp eye and a name people remembered. But I was watching. Watching the streets, the people, the way money moved from hand to hand. And I started thinking maybe America wasn't about open doors. Maybe it was about learning how to pick the lock. That night, I went home, lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city outside, the trolley bells, the shouts in the street, the distant clop of horses, and I knew something was coming. Something big. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing at the edge of a wave that was gonna change everything. And I was ready to ride it. You don't pick the life picks you. And when it does, it don't ever let go. By the time the newspapers were talking about the 18th Amendment and the noble experiment of banning liquor, I'd already learned where I belonged. Not behind some factory machine, not breaking my back for a foreman who'd forget my name the second I quit. My place was out there, on the street, in the rooms where deals got made and fortunes got decided over a glass of whiskey somebody swore was water. It was the mid-1910s, and the little street gangs I used to run with were changin'. They weren't just packs of kids robbing pushcarts anymore. They were morphin' into organized outfits, crews with leaders, connections, rules. The kind of structure that could turn nickels into hundreds, hundreds into thousands. That's when I met the 5 Points Gang. Now, the 5 Points name was already famous before my time. Irish toughs, Italian enforcers, guys who'd fight for a block of pavement like it was sacred land. But in my day, it was the training ground for the real pros. That's where I learned discipline. Not the kind they talk about in school books, this was street discipline. Don't start a fight you can't finish. Don't flash money you can't protect. Don't make promises you can't keep. One of the first guys to take notice of me there was Johnny Torrio. Smart, smooth, always dressed like he was going to a bank meeting, even if the only thing he was gonna rob was the bank itself. Torrio wasn't about wild shootouts or flashy headlines. He was about business. He'd say, "Kid, you can only kill a guy once. But you can do business with him 100 times if you know how to keep him alive." That stuck with me. Through Torrio, I met Frankie Yale. Yale ran the Harvard Inn over in Coney Island, a joint where sailors, tourists, and wise guys all rubbed elbows. I worked the door sometimes, carding drunks, breaking up fights, keeping my eyes open. You learn a lot when you're the guy everybody has to walk past to get in. Who's flush, who's broke, who's got trouble written all over him. Frankie liked me 'cause I didn't scare easy, and I knew when to keep my mouth shut. It was during those years I started to understand the real game, alliances. See, you could be the toughest guy in the world, but if you were alone, you were just a target. You needed friends. Not the kind who sent you birthday cards, the kind who'd put themselves between you and a bullet. Guys like Meyer Lansky. I met Meyer around this time. Small guy, sharp dresser, even sharper brain. We played dice in the back of a pool hall one night, and I watched him clean out a table full of grown men without raising his voice once. When the last guy stormed off, Meyer looked at me and said, "Lucky, money's like water, it's always looking for a place to flow. You just gotta build the right channels." That was the first time I realized I'd found someone who thought like me. The streets in those days, they were alive. Daytime was noisy, the markets buzzing, kids running around, cops strolling by like they owned the place. But at night, it changed. The air got heavier, the shadows got longer, and you could feel the unspoken rules settle in. If you were walking somewhere after dark, you better know who owned that block or you were liable to find out the hard way. One night, I was on Mulberry Street with a couple of the boys when a crew from across town tried to muscle in on one of our card games. Things got ugly quick, chairs went flying, bottles broke, fists turned to knives. I caught a slash on my forearm that left a scar I still had years later. But I also walked out of there with the pot and my crew intact. That mattered. In the street, scars are just another kind of currency. They tell people you've been there, you've paid your dues. But here's the thing, every fight, every deal, every night on the corner was leading somewhere bigger. We could all feel it. Prohibition was coming, and with it, an ocean of opportunity. If the country wanted to go dry, the streets were about to get wet, real wet. And the guys who controlled the flow? They'd control everything. Sometimes I'd stand at the docks, watching the ships come in from Europe, thinking about all the cargo they could carry if the right palms got greased. Booze, cigars, silk, whatever people craved and couldn't get legally. Torrio would talk about routes through Canada, connections in Chicago, shipments hidden under crates of fruit. It was like a storm building over the horizon. You couldn't stop it, you could only decide if you were gonna run from it or ride it. Me? I already knew my answer. I wasn't built to run. And with the crew I was building, guys like Meyer, guys I could trust, we had the brains, the guts, and the ambition. The streets were choosing their kings, and I intended to be one of them. By 1919, the talk of prohibition was no longer talk, it was law. The day it went into effect, I walked past a bar on the Bowery. The windows were dark, the doors locked. But in the alley around back? There was a line of men waiting for a bottle, cash in hand. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment. I didn't know exactly how it would play out yet, but I knew this New York was about to change. And if I played it right, I wouldn't just survive it. I'd own it. When the country went dry, the streets got drunk on money, power, and blood. January 17, 1920. The Volstead Act kicks in, and overnight, America's favorite pastime becomes a crime. They called it prohibition, like it was gonna make people better. All it did was make guys like me rich. You think a nation that fought for independence was gonna let some law tell them they couldn't have a drink after work? Not in this lifetime. That morning, the bars closed, the breweries shut their doors, and the factories stopped bottling beer. But by sundown, the same booze was flowing, only now it cost 10 times as much and came with a little extra risk. And risk? That's where the money lives. I didn't waste time. I had contacts, through Torrio, through Yale, through the docks. But the man who really opened the next chapter of my life was Arnold Rothstein, the brain. He wasn't a street guy like me. He didn't need to throw punches or wave a gun. He played cards in tailored suits, read the stock market like a bedtime story, and talked about crime like it was a legitimate business. Rothstein was the kind of guy who made you think bigger. He taught me how to use prohibition like a lever. It wasn't just about running booze from point A to point B, it was about controlling the pipeline. Canada down through the Great Lakes, shipments from Europe through the Caribbean, and local distilleries hidden in basements all over the city. The trick wasn't moving it. The trick was making sure nobody else could move it without you getting your cut. We set up speakeasies, hidden rooms behind soda shops, basements under restaurants, even fake social clubs where you needed a knock and a password to get in. By the mid-1920s, I couldn't walk 10 blocks without passing a joint we either owned outright or taxed for protection. Some of them were dives with sawdust on the floor. Others were pure-class, mahogany bars, jazz bands, cigarette girls, the works. The nights were electric. You'd walk into one of our uptown clubs, and it was like stepping into another world, flappers in sequin dresses, men in tuxedos, the smell of perfume mixing with the bite of gin. On the surface, it looked like a party. Underneath, it was a machine, bartenders pouring just fast enough to keep the crowd happy, waiters making sure the high rollers were taken care of, and my guys in the corners making sure nobody got ideas about skipping their tab. We had muscle, sure, but Rothstein made sure we had brains, too. We bribed cops, judges, customs officials. We didn't just dodge the law, we owned enough of it to make the rest irrelevant. Every handshake came with an envelope. Every meeting ended with a drink. Money talked, and during Prohibition, it never shut up. Of course, business wasn't all champagne and caviar. The competition was brutal. Every small-time would thought he could get a truck, fill it with whiskey, and make himself a fortune. But that kind of thinking gets you killed. I remember one run where we were moving a shipment from upstate. Snowstorm hit, road was slick. We came around a bend, and there they were, 2 trucks blocking the road, a crew with shotguns. They weren't there to say hello. We could have tried to talk, but in those days, hesitation was a bullet in the head. My driver hit the gas, my guys opened fire out the windows, and we broke through with half the shipment still intact. It wasn't pretty, but it sent a message: we were here to stay. Rothstein always told me to keep my eye on the big picture. Lucky, he'd say, the liquor's just the start. The real money's in what it buys you: power, connections, leverage. And he was right. Booze was the foundation. On top of it, we built gambling rackets, loan sharking operations, labor union control. By diversifying, we made sure no single hit could sink us. But the brain wasn't immortal. In 1928, he got himself killed, supposedly over a fixed poker game. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the vacuum he left behind. And if you know anything about the underworld, you know there's no such thing as an empty throne. His death was a wake-up call. I realized that if Rothstein could go, anyone could. That's when I started thinking about building something that didn't rely on just one man, a structure, a network. Something that could survive a bullet, a prison sentence, even a war. Meanwhile, the law was catching on, sort of. The cops raided joints, smashed barrels in the street, posed for the papers like they were saving the city from itself. But the truth? For every barrel they smashed, 10 more were getting poured in a basement somewhere. Prohibition wasn't stopping the drinking, it was just changing the menu. My crew grew tighter. Meyer was handling the numbers, making sure every dollar got counted twice. Bugsy Siegel was out front, making connections, smoothing over situations before they turned bloody, or making sure they turned bloody when that was the better option. We weren't just a gang anymore. We were a business. I'll tell you one thing those years taught me: the value of patience. Everybody wanted to be a big shot overnight. But the real winners? They took their time. They built brick by brick, deal by deal. When you're moving that much liquor, you can't think about just tomorrow. You gotta think about the next year, the next decade. By the end of the decade, the city was ours in everything but name. We had speakeasies uptown, downtown, out in Brooklyn, Queens, even across the river in Jersey. We knew every cop who could be bought, every judge who liked a good bottle, every politician who wanted a quiet place to meet his mistress. But if Prohibition gave us everything, it also painted a target on our backs. And in the shadows, a different kind of trouble was brewing, the kind that didn't come from the cops, but from other guys who wanted what we had. They weren't satisfied with a few blocks or a few clubs. They wanted the whole city. And to get it, they were willing to spill blood. That's the thing about power, it don't just attract money and respect. It attracts enemies. And soon enough, the streets were gonna be on fire again. In this town, wars don't get fought with flags, they get fought in alleyways, with your best friend aiming the gun. By the start of 1930, the easy money from Prohibition wasn't so easy anymore. Every crew had tasted the gold, and every crew wanted more. It wasn't just small-time beefs anymore, this was a full-on chessboard, and the pieces were families. On one side, you had Joe the Boss Masuria. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano. And stuck between them? Guys like me smart enough to know picking the wrong side could be the last decision you ever make. Masuria was an old-school type, heavy-set, flashy, liked to remind everybody he was * boss of bosses. * he ran his rackets like a king runs a kingdom, absolute control, no arguments, no negotiations. You worked under him, you paid your tribute, you didn't ask questions. Maranzano was different. He came from Sicily, fresh off the boat, all about tradition, honor, the true ways. He saw Masuria as a greedy, Americanized sellout. 4 months, tension simmered. Crews that used to drink together stopped showing up in the same rooms. Guys looked over their shoulders twice before shaking hands. When the first shots were fired, nobody was surprised, it was just the start of what would be called the Castellamarese War. The war was chaos. 1 week you were collecting from a speakeasy owner, the next, you were ducking behind a car while bullets tore up the street. Everyone was armed, everyone was jumpy. The newspapers loved it, front-page headlines, grainy photos of bodies covered with sheets. But for us, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival. Here's the part people don't always get: I wasn't loyal to Masuria or Maranzano. I was loyal to Luciano. To my future. And that meant playing both sides, carefully. I met with Masuria, took his money, carried out his orders. Then I'd turn around and keep my lines open with Maranzano's people, making sure if the tides turned, I wouldn't be left out in the cold. It was dangerous. One wrong word and either side could decide I was a traitor. One night, I got the closest I've ever been to not walking away. I was called to meet Masuria's crew at a little Italian joint in Coney Island. On the way, I got this feeling like the air was too still, like the city was holding its breath. When I walked in, 3 of his guys were their faces hard, hands a little too close to their coats. I smiled, cracked a joke, kept my voice easy. Then I told them I needed to step outside to make a call. I didn't come back. I found out later they'd been ordered to take me for a ride I wouldn't come back from. That was my turning point. You can only dance on a wire for so long before it snaps. If Masuria wanted me dead, then I just have to make sure he went first. But killing a boss isn't like knocking over a card game. You don't just walk up and pull the trigger. You need timing. You need the right men. And you need a story that keeps your name out of the papers, at least for a while. I went to Maranzano. Told him I could end this war. Told him all I needed was his blessing and a promise. The blessing was to take out Masuria. The promise was that, when the smoke cleared, I'd be his number 2. He agreed. And just like that, the wheels were in motion. April 15, 1931, Coney Island again. Masuria loved the card tables at Nuova Villa tomorrow. I showed up smiling, laughing, playing my part. After a few hands, I excused myself to the bathroom. While I was gone, my men Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis walked in. By the time I came back, it was over. 4 bullets in the boss, cards still in his hand. The papers said he'd been holding an ace of diamonds and an ace of spades. Fitting, if you believe in that kind of poetry. With Masuria gone, the war was supposed to be over. Maranzano took the crown * boss of bosses. * for a while, I played the loyal underboss. I nodded in meetings. I handled business. I made him money. But the thing about crowns is, they make a man's head heavy. And Maranzano started acting like his head was the only one that mattered. He brought in more Sicilians from the old country, pushed out guys he didn't trust, and most dangerous of all, he started talking about eliminating anyone he saw as a threat. Guess who was at the top of that list? Word got to me through a contact in his crew. Maranzano was planning my funeral. I didn't wait for the invite. I called a meeting of my own, not with the commission, not with the capos. With killers. Trusted, sharp, fast. Men who could walk into an office and make it look like they were there on official business. September 10, 1931, Maranzano's office on Park Avenue. He thought he was meeting IRS agents. My guys walked in with badges, smiled, then pulled their guns. It was over in seconds. No speeches, no drama. Just silence. That day was the end of the old way. No more * boss of bosses. * no more one man holding the strings for everyone else. I'd seen what that kind of power did, it made you a target. Instead, I had a new vision. We'd form a commission, a table where the major families could sit down, settle disputes, and keep the cops and the newspapers off our backs. Like a board of directors, only our stock was the entire underworld. But that's the thing about change, it doesn't make you safe. It just gives you a different set of enemies. The war was over. But the game? The game had only just begun. They called him boss of bosses. Me? I just called him next. When Maranzano hit the floor that September day, the echoes didn't stop in his office, they ran through every bar, backroom, and basement in New York. Guys who'd been smiling in his meetings the week before were suddenly changing their stories, saying they'd always had doubts about him. The old way of doing things died with him, and I was the one left standing in the smoke. Now here's the thing, when you take out a boss, you don't get to relax. The minute you pull the trigger, you've started a clock. Every second that passes, somebody's thinking, if he could take out Maranzano, he could take me out too. That means you either grab the steering wheel fast or you get thrown out of the car. So I started moving. I called in the biggest names from the major families, Mangano, Prophesy, Gagliano, Bonanno, and of course, my own people. We met in quiet rooms far from the ears of cops and reporters. I told him plain, no more one-man rule. No more boss of bosses. The title had become a curse. From now on, we'd have the commission, a round table where disputes got settled without turning the streets into war zones. A system where everyone got a piece and no one got so big they couldn't be touched. It wasn't just about avoiding blood, it was about money. Wars are bad for business. They drain cash, they scare customers, they attract heat. I told them, we run this like a business, we all get richer. You keep the headlines out of the papers, the feds keep their noses in somebody else's mess. Some of them grumbled, sure, but they weren't blind. They'd seen what 2 years of war had done. They wanted peace. In the weeks after, I kept my movements quiet. You don't celebrate after a power shift. You let the dust settle, you let people get used to the new landscape. But I also made sure my crew knew the score: loyalty in, rewards out. Anyone who stepped out of line? They disappeared. Quietly, efficiently. You want order, you have to show you can keep it. I'll be honest, part of me liked Maranzano. Not the way he ran things, but the way he carried himself. He had this belief in the old traditions, the Sicilian codes. Problem was, he tried to use them like shackles, holding everybody else in place while he took what he wanted. Me? I saw the future in mixing the old with the new. Keep the respect, the rules, the loyalty, but throw out the stuff that kept us from growing. That's where guys like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello came in. They weren't bound by Sicilian bloodlines or island politics. They thought like businessmen, same as me. Together, we started structuring things like a corporation. Territories became branches, crews became departments, and we started looking at the rackets like investment portfolios. Gambling, unions, booze, everything was a revenue stream, and everything had to flow through the right channels. Of course, power brings its own kind of quiet tension. There were still whispers, guys wondering if I'd end up like the bosses before me, with a knife in my back or a bullet in my head. But I didn't walk around with a crown on my head. I played it low. I still walked the streets, visited the clubs, kept my ear to the ground. You can't run an empire from a locked room. You gotta feel the city breathing. I remember one night at the Waldorf, sitting in a private suite with Lansky, Costello, and a couple of out-of-town guys. We were drinking Canadian whiskey, talking about expanding into Havana. The city lights stretched out under us like a map. Lansky said, lucky, you realize no one's ever done what you're doing, bringing all these guys together without a war? I shrugged and said, that's 'cause no one ever tried treating them like partners instead of soldiers. But I wasn't naive. I knew the peace wouldn't last forever. There's always somebody willing to roll the dice for a bigger cut. My job was to make sure the stakes for breaking the rules were so high nobody dared. And in those first months after Maranzano, it worked. The streets were calmer, the rackets were cleaner, and the money flowed like never before. Speakeasies, union deals, numbers games, we had our hands in all of it. Everyone was eating. And when everyone's eating, Fewer people think about biting the hand that feeds them. Still, even in the calm, you could feel the undercurrent. The feds were watching. Reformers were talking about cleaning up the city. And somewhere out there, a man named Dewey was already making a name for himself as the kind of prosecutor who didn't scare easy. That was a problem for tomorrow. For now, I'd done what nobody thought possible. I'd taken the chaos of the Castellammarese War and turned it into order. Not perfect order. Not permanent order. But enough to make the streets breathe easy for the first time in years. But in this life? Easy breathing never lasts. They say peace is just the quiet before the next storm. I say it's the time you build walls high enough to keep the storm out. By early 32, the commission was more than just an idea, it was a machine. The 5 families had their seats at the table, each with a voice, each with a stake. Every decision, who ran which racket, who collected from which neighborhood, even who could be straightened out into the life, went through us. It was order in a business that had lived off chaos. I made it clear, if you had a beef, you brought it to the table. No drive-by vendettas. No making the front page with a bloody spectacle. Disputes got settled with handshakes and contracts, not Tommy guns. It wasn't about being soft, it was about keeping the money flowing. Blood on the sidewalk scared customers, and scared customers meant empty pockets. I modeled it like a corporation. Each family was a department, and every racket was a division with its own managers, collections, and quotas. We diversified. Booze from Canada and rum from the Caribbean were still moving through our lines, but that was just one piece. Numbers games in Harlem, gambling dens in Brooklyn, union rackets in the docks and construction, each stream feeding into the bigger river. Union work became a gold mine. With the docks under Mangano's influence and the construction trades in Prophesie's hands, we could control shipments, set wages, and skim without anyone daring to push back. If a company wanted their goods unloaded on time, they paid. If they wanted a strike to end, they paid. And the best part? It all looked like legitimate labor disputes from the outside. That was the genius of the new order, it blurred the line between legal and illegal. We had lawyers, accountants, front businesses. A guy could walk into one of our offices and think he was in a legitimate import-export company, not the headquarters for half the city's rackets. I kept Meyer Lansky close during this time. He had a knack for making the numbers sing. If I was the architect, he was the engineer, turning every hustle into a system. He started pushing investments overseas, Havana, the Bahamas, even whispers about getting a foothold in Las Vegas before it became the gambling capital of the world. The way he saw it, if we were gonna be businessmen, we had to think global. Frank Costello handled the political side. He knew which palms to grease, which campaigns to quietly fund, which laws to nudge in our favor. Before long, we had judges who owed us favors, cops who looked the other way, and city officials who'd pick up the phone when we called. It wasn't just about avoiding heat, it was about shaping the climate. But the streets still needed watching. I never stopped making my rounds, shaking hands in clubs, talking to soldiers, making sure every man felt the weight of my presence. You can't rule from an ivory tower in this business, you gotta let people feel like you're one of them, even when you're sitting at the top. One night in Little Italy, I stopped into a small social club, just a handful of old-timers playing cards and a couple of young guys learning the ropes. I sat down, poured a glass of wine, and listened. They talked about collections, about small-time hustles, about a guy skimming too much off his end. I didn't say much, just nodded, smiled, asked a question here or there. But when I left, they knew I'd heard everything and that nothing they did was too small for me to notice. That's the part people don't see in the movies. It's not all gunfights and cigars. It's the quiet checks, the subtle reminders, the sense that the boss's eyes are everywhere. That's how you keep order without firing a shot. And for a while, it worked like clockwork. Money flowed. Tempers cooled. And the papers were writing about other scandals, political ones, business frauds, Wall Street swindles. We stayed out of the spotlight, just like I wanted. But success breeds jealousy, and jealousy breeds ambition. I started hearing murmurs, small at first, about guys in outlying crews thinking they could cut their own deals without kicking up to the commission. A gambling den here, a side hustle there. Nothing big enough to break the peace yet. That's when I knew peace isn't something you keep by hoping for the best. It's something you enforce. Quietly. Permanently. One example made the rounds. A crew out of Jersey decided they could run their own numbers game without paying tribute. I sent a couple of my men not to rough them up, not to make a scene, but to sit down at their table, look them in the eye, and explain the rules. When one of them mouthed off, they found him floating in the river the next morning. Nobody said a word, but everyone heard the message loud and clear. By the end of that year, the commission wasn't just a council, it was the law of the underworld. And I wasn't just another boss. I was the man who'd built a system so strong even my enemies had to play by it. But I also knew that systems have weak points. And the one weak point in ours was the same as it had always been, the law. Cops could be bought, sure. But prosecutors? Men like Thomas Dewey? They weren't playing for money. They were playing for headlines, for power, for their names carved into the city's history. And I had a feeling my name was about to end up in their crosshairs. The thing about power is, it don't always get taken by a rival with a gun. Sometimes, it gets chipped away by a man in a suit with a pen and a plan. By 35, Thomas E. Dewey was making his name in the papers as the city's crime-busting golden boy. He wasn't just another cop on the take. He was a special prosecutor, handpicked to clean up organized crime, and he meant it. The public loved him. He had that Boy Scout look, the kind that made housewives feel safe and businessmen feel hopeful. But under that clean-shaven smile was a guy who wanted to build his career on taking down someone like me. Now, we'd handled plenty of prosecutors before. You send a guy to talk to them, maybe slide an envelope across the table. If that doesn't work, you find dirt, gambling debts, a mistress, something to keep them quiet. But Dewey? He was different. No debts, no secrets, and too ambitious to take a payoff. That made him dangerous. At first, I didn't take him too seriously. He started with small-time vice cases, shutting down brothels, raiding illegal gambling joints, making the evening news with handcuffed lowlifes. It looked like political theater. But behind the scenes, he was building a case the old-fashioned way, slow, steady, piece by piece. And he wasn't coming at me directly. He was going after the girls. See, part of our business, quiet, steady money, came from the prostitution rackets. Not the back alley kind, but organized, high-end operations. We had madams who ran things like clockwork, kept the cops happy, paid the right people. It wasn't the flashiest racket, but it paid, and more importantly, it gave us leverage in other deals. Dewey knew this. He started leaning on the girls, offering them deals in exchange for testimony. A lot of them were loyal, but loyalty has a price, and when you're staring at time in a women's prison, that price goes up. Slowly, he flipped a few. Not the ones in the papers, those were distractions. The real prize were the ones who could connect the business back to me. Meyer kept telling me, *lucky, this guy's playing chess. He's not looking to raid you, he's looking to corner you. And I'll admit, I started to see it. Every week, another low-level guy got pinched. Every week, another subpoena went out. He was tightening the net, and the newspapers were eating it up. Dewey strikes again. Vice racket in retreat. Stories that made him look like a hero and made our world look like it was on the ropes. The commission didn't like the attention. Some of the bosses started whispering that maybe I should take a vacation, lay low until the heat died down. But that wasn't my style. You disappear, and people start thinking you're weak. Weakness gets you replaced. So I played it cool. Kept making my rounds, kept business running. But I also told my guys, keep your mouths shut, keep the books clean, and don't get sloppy. I didn't want to give Dewey any easy wins. Then came the night I knew the tide was turning. I was at the Waldorf, meeting with a few out-of-town associates, when one of my guys walked in looking like he'd seen a ghost. He leaned in and whispered, "They flipped Cokie Flo." Cokie Flo Brown, one of the madams who'd been in the life for years. She'd always been solid, kept her girls in line, never complained about her cut. But Dewey's people had gotten to her. Word was she'd been arrested, and instead of taking the fall, she'd started talking. Names. Dates. Places. Enough to start stitching a case together with my name on the top. It wasn't panic that hit me, it was calculation. I knew if she was talking, others might follow. Dewey didn't need the truth, he just needed enough to make it look like the truth to a jury. And juries? They love a good story about bringing down a so-called kingpin. The next weeks were a blur of strategy meetings. Lansky wanted to shift operations out of New York temporarily, let the storm pass. Costello said we should start working the political angles harder, maybe even find a way to discredit Dewey publicly. I listened, weighed it all, but deep down, I knew this wasn't going away. This wasn't a passing headline. Dewey was building his legacy, and I was the cornerstone. The real move came in 36. Dewey dropped a bomb, 62 counts of compulsory prostitution, all tied to me. He claimed I was the mastermind, the one who controlled the entire vice racket in the city. It was a stretch, but it didn't have to be true, it just had to sound believable in court. The trial was a circus. Reporters packed the room, sketch artists scribbling every expression I made. Dewey played it like theater, painting me as this shadow figure who pulled strings from behind the scenes, ruining lives for profit. He paraded girl after girl onto the stand, each one telling her story, each one tying it back to me, even if the threads were thin. My lawyers fought hard, tore holes in their stories, questioned their credibility. But Dewey wasn't playing for logic, he was playing for emotion. He made the jury feel like they were standing up for decency, for law and order. And in that kind of fight, facts don't matter as much as feelings. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, they gave me 30 to 50 years in Clinton prison. The room erupted, Dewey shaking hands, reporters rushing for the phones. Me? I just sat back, lit a cigarette, and thought, so this is the storm. But here's the thing, prison ain't the end for a guy like me. It's just a change of scenery. And as I was let out in cuffs, I already had a plan forming. The commission was still out there. The money was still flowing. And I still had friends in high places. Dewey might have thought he'd put me away for good. But I'd learned a long time ago, you can't cage influence. You can lock up a man, sure. But the reach? That lives on. They thought Clinton prison would be the end of me. Steel bars, gray stone walls, snow blowing in off the Canadian border, it was about as far from the Waldorf as a man could get. The guards figured they'd broken me. Dewey figured he'd made history. The papers called it the fall of Lucky Luciano. Let M talk. I'd been in tight spots before. This was just another angle to work. From day one inside, I played it smart. No grandstanding, no picking fights. You don't win in a place like this by acting like you're still king of the street, you win by knowing which levers to pull. The guards respected a man who didn't make trouble. The other inmates respected a man who could get things done. Within weeks, I had cigarettes moving in, coffee for the right people, a little hooch when the weather turned cold. But my real game wasn't inside these walls, it was still out there in the city I'd built my name on. The commission didn't vanish just because I was upstate. Meyer Lansky kept our finances clean. Frank Costello handled the politics. And Vito Genovese, well, he was supposed to keep things running. I kept in touch through letters, visits, and messages slipped through lawyers. I knew every major move before it happened, and I gave my blessing or my veto. Guys who thought I'd lost my say learned quick that distance doesn't erase authority. In this life, reputation travels faster than any train. The nights were the hardest. Laying on that thin mattress, hearing the wind howl outside, I'd think about the streets, the smell of the city after rain, the neon lights bouncing off wet pavement, the hum of a place that never slept. In here, the air was stale, the silence broken only by the clank of gates and the shuffle of boots on concrete. Still, I reminded myself patience. You keep breathing, you keep planning, and sooner or later, an opportunity walks through that door. That opportunity came wearing a Navy uniform. It was 1942, and the world had gone to war. The newspapers were full of headlines about battles in Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. was scrambling to secure its coasts, worried about German subs prowling offshore. Then one day, my lawyer shows up with a strange request. A couple of government men wanted to talk. Not cops. Not politicians. Navy intelligence. They'd been having a problem: sabotage on the docks, fires breaking out in warehouses, whispers about enemy agents slipping into the city. The Navy needed control over the waterfront, and they knew the truth: the docks were our turf. At first, I thought it was a joke. The same government that had put me away was now asking for my help. But they were dead serious. They wanted me to use my connections to make sure the waterfront stayed safe, that no more accidents happened, and that information flowed their way. In exchange, they'd make sure the people who mattered knew I'd been helpful. I didn't trust them. Never trust a man who comes smiling with a favor after he's put you in chains. But I wasn't stupid either. This was leverage, and leverage was the one thing you can always trade. So I agreed. Through intermediaries, I let the right guys know that the docks were now off limits for trouble. Longshoremen who'd been slow to cooperate suddenly found their foreman leaning on them. Any rumors about spies got passed along quickly. And the fires? They stopped. For the Navy, it was a win. For me, it was planting a seed. I made sure they understood. When the war was over, we'd remember this arrangement. Meanwhile, life in Clinton rolled on. Winters were brutal, snow piled against the walls, the cold cutting through even the thickest coat. Summers were stifling, the air heavy and still. I kept my routine: in mornings in the yard, afternoons in the shop, evenings reading or playing cards. It wasn't freedom, but it was order, and order keeps a man from losing himself. Once in a while, word from the outside would rattle the calm. I heard about Genovese trying to edge in on Costello's territory. I heard about new blood coming up in Brooklyn, kids who didn't remember the old days and thought they could make a name without paying respect. Every time, I'd send a message, sometimes gentle, sometimes not. The point was always the same: Lucky might be in Clinton, but Lucky was still in charge. The guards noticed I never got into fights. Never got caught with contraband. Never mouthed off. Some called it discipline. I called it survival. If you give them an excuse to break you, they'll take it. If you keep your head down, you can move mountains in the shadows. Then, in '45, the war ended. The boys in uniform came home heroes, the city erupted in celebration, and the Navy men who'd once sat across from me in a cold meeting room started making calls on my behalf. They talked to Dewey, who was now governor, about how I'd assisted the war effort. They made it sound noble, patriotic, even. It took months of back and forth, but in January 1946, the word came down: I was getting a commutation. Not a pardon, mind you. Dewey wasn't about to admit he'd been wrong, but enough to get me out of Clinton. There was one condition: I had to leave the United States and not come back. They thought they were getting rid of me. I knew better. That night, before I left Clinton for the last time, I stood at the window of my cell and looked out at the yard. Snow was falling, the lights casting it in a soft glow. I thought about all the men who'd come through here and never left, about the whispers that had moved through these walls, the deals made in the yard, the grudges born in the mess hall. When the guard came to get me, I stepped out without looking back. I wasn't walking away from the life, I was just changing the address. Naples smelled different than New York. No mix of hot asphalt and roasted chestnuts, no steam rising from subway grates, no symphony of taxi horns. Here, it was the sea salt and diesel from the fishing boats, garlic from the kitchens, cigarette smoke curling through narrow alleys. I stood on the dock the morning I arrived in 1946, a suitcase in my hand, a tailored suit on my back, and the weight of exile pressing on my shoulders. They called it deportation. I called it a relocation. The United States was out of reach, but the game, the real game, wasn't bound by borders. You can take a man out of New York, but you can't take New York out of the man. The Italian officials didn't know what to make of me. Some treated me like a celebrity, others like a curse. The papers here had read the American headlines, *lucky Luciano king of the underworld*, but in Naples, I was just another man with a past too dangerous to ignore. The cops watched me from across the street, not realizing that I'd been watched my whole life. At first, I kept quiet. I rented a villa overlooking the bay, spent my mornings drinking coffee, my afternoons strolling the streets, my evenings with old friends and new acquaintances. But staying quiet in my line of work is like leaving a gun on the table, it only lasts until someone decides to pick it up. The war had left Italy in ruins. Cities bombed out, families torn apart, black markets thriving in every port. Food was rationed, fuel scarce, and the black market was the only way most people survived. I knew opportunity when I saw it. In Naples, opportunity was everywhere if you had the nerve to reach for it. I started with cigarettes. American brands were gold here: Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. Through contacts in Sicily and Marseille, I arranged shipments. They came in under the radar, slipped through customs with the right bribes, and hit the streets at triple the price. The money was good, but more importantly, it reminded people who I was. The name Luciano began to mean something in Italy: power, supply, control. But cigarettes were just the beginning. There was heroin coming out of Turkey in the Middle East, morphine base moving through Marseille's waterfront, and the demand in America was rising fast. The French had the labs, the Italians had the connections, and the Sicilians, well, they had no shortage of young men willing to take risks. From my villa in Naples, I could see the lines forming. All I had to do was connect them. Still, there were nights I'd sit on my balcony, a glass of grappa in hand, staring at the lights on the water, and feel the ache for New York. The Lower East Side. Broadway. The Waldorf. The hum of a city that was mine once. I'd hear rumors: Costello running things, Lansky keeping the books tight, Genovese sniffing around like a dog who'd been waiting for me to be out of the picture. I kept in touch, but it wasn't the same. You can't shake a man's hand or read his eyes over a letter. In 1947, I got my first taste of how the old world and the new world could still mix. There was a sit-down in Havana. Cuba was becoming the next big thing, with casinos, hotels, and a government happy to look the other way. Meyer Lansky was building his empire there, and he wanted me to be part of it. Getting there wasn't simple. Officially, I wasn't supposed to set foot in the Western Hemisphere again. But unofficially? Let's just say a ship left Genoa one night with a passenger not listed on the manifest. Weeks later, I was stepping onto the dock in Havana, the warm Caribbean air wrapping around me like an old friend. Havana was electric rum music, laughter spilling into the streets. The Nacional Hotel lit up the night, the casinos buzzing with money. Lansky met me like no time had passed. We sat in a private room, the air thick with cigar smoke, and he laid it out: the mob would run Havana's gambling, skimming millions before the government saw a dime. Batista's people were in on it, the cops were bought, and the tourists from New York and Miami couldn't get enough. I agreed, of course. Business was business, and I still had a taste for it. For a few months, it felt like the old days: meetings, deals, handshakes sealed with smiles that meant something. Guys came down from the States just to sit at my table, to let the world know they still kissed the ring. But good things don't last when the feds have your name on a list. Word got back to Washington that I was in Havana, and it lit a fire under the same politicians who'd sworn I'd never set foot close to America again. Hoover and his boys leaned on the Cubans, and before long, Batista's men were knocking on my door. No discussion, no chance to negotiate. I was on the next plane back to Italy, escorted like a package they couldn't wait to return. Back in Naples, I didn't waste time sulking. The Havana venture had shown me something. Distance didn't kill influence, but it sure made it harder to hold on to. If I wanted to keep my hand in the game, I'd need stronger lines of communication, tighter networks, and a reputation that didn't fade with geography. So I doubled down on the international rackets. The heroin trade grew fast, too fast. The profits were huge, but the risks were bigger. In America, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was starting to sniff around. In Italy, the Carabinieri kept a closer eye on my movements. Every trip I took to Rome, every meeting in Palermo, every dinner in Marseille, it was noticed. But here's the thing, being watched never scared me. It only meant they still thought I mattered. By the early 50s, the network was solid. Product came from Turkey, processed in France, shipped through Sicily, and moved into the States. I never touched it myself, of course, always insulated, always at arm's length. If something went wrong, there were layers between me and the mess. Still, there was no denying the loneliness. I had money, power, connections, but New York was gone to me. Some nights I'd dream about the city, about walking into the Waldorf bar, a hush that would fall, the way men would stand a little straighter when I passed. I'd wake up to the sound of the sea, and for a few seconds, I'd think I was home. Then I'd remember. By the mid-50s, health started creeping into the picture. I'd lived hard, and prison hadn't done my body any favors. Doctors in Naples told me to take it easy, cut down on the smoking, drink less, avoid stress. I laughed. In my world, avoiding stress was like avoiding the sunrise. I kept going because stopping wasn't an option. Not for a man like me. If the streets of New York were closed, I'd rule the docks of Naples, the casinos of Havana, the shipping lanes between Marseille and Palermo. A king without a country is still a king, he just changes the borders. And so I built, piece by piece, knowing the clock was ticking, knowing the world was changing, and knowing, deep down, that sooner or later, the past has a way of finding you. By the time 1955 rolled around, I could feel the years pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. My reflection in the mirror was still sharp dressed, still carrying that easy smile that fooled most men, but the eyes told the truth. They were tired. Not from lack of sleep, I trained myself to live on a few hours a night, but from the constant watching, the constant planning, the constant knowledge that somewhere, someone was either trying to take what I had or put me in the ground. Doctors in Naples had started whispering about my heart. They'd poke and prod, give me advice I ignored, and write prescriptions I never filled. A man in my position can't just slow down. If you slow down, you're dead, maybe not right away, but soon enough. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The heroin pipeline we'd built was running smoother than a Swiss watch. Turkey supplied the morphine base, Marseille processed it into pure heroin, and Sicily moved it like clockwork. From there, the American ports took it in wrapped in cargo crates, tucked inside furniture, even hidden in cans labeled asterisk olive oil. Asterisk, it was poetry in motion, a web stretched across continents. But the thing about a web is, the bigger it gets, the more I see it. In the States, Harry Anslinger's Federal Bureau of Narcotics was making noise. They were chasing shadows, but every now and then they'd catch a loose thread, a courier in New Jersey, a dock worker in New Orleans, a warehouse in Brooklyn. And each time they pulled on that thread, I could feel the tug all the way in Naples. That's when I started thinking about legacy. Not just the money or the rackets, but the name, Luciano. In New York, it still meant something, but time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges. Guys who once toasted my name were now loyal to others, Costello, Genovese, Anastasia. I'd read about their moves in the American papers, wondering which of them would end up on top and which would get carried out feet first. Genovese especially had been playing his cards bold. He'd been in Italy during the war, working angles with the Germans, the Allies, whoever could give him leverage. Now he was back in New York, and I knew him well enough to see where his ambition was heading. He wanted it all, and he wasn't the kind of man to stop at half measures. From Naples, I tried to keep a hand in things. Messages went back and forth through couriers, coded letters, phone calls routed through friendly businesses. Sometimes I'd get Meyer Lansky on the line, and we'd talk about Havana, about the hotels, about how the game was changing. Meyer was cautious, always had been, but he understood the value of keeping me in the loop. Still, there's only so much you can control from across an ocean. The new generation in New York didn't know me their fortunes the way the old guard did. They'd heard the stories, sure, but stories don't command the same respect as the man himself standing in the room. That's why, when the chance came to send word through certain channels that I was still watching, I took it. The opportunity came when one of my trusted Sicilian contacts, a man named Salvatore Greco, hinted that the Americans were losing control of the heroin routes through Canada. The RCMP was focused on the French connection, but the Italians were slipping product in through Montreal and down into New York. It was risky, but it was a way to remind certain people in the city that my network still had reach. I gave the green light. A few months later, the money started flowing, and with it came whispers, Luciano's still in the game. Luciano's still calling shots. It wasn't about the profits, it was about the message. But health has a way of ignoring pride. In late '57, after a particularly long night of meetings in Palermo, I woke up with a pain in my chest like someone had driven an ice pick straight through. I sat on the edge of the bed, sweating, breathing hard, trying to will it away. It passed after a while, but it left me rattled. The same year, news from New York shook me more than the pain had. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner had been gunned down in a barber chair. I knew the moment I heard it that this was Genovese's move, clearing the board. Sure enough, not long after, Vito was making plays to push Costello aside. It was the kind of ruthless consolidation I'd once been famous for, and in another life, maybe I would have respected it. But here, from Naples, it just made me feel the cold wind of change. The game was moving on without me. I started thinking about my early days, the Lower East Side, the 5 Points gang, the nights running with Meyer and Bugsy, the deals with Masuria and Maranzano. Back then, every day felt like it was carved out of marble, meant to last forever. Now I knew better. Nothing lasts forever, not power, not money, not even the fear your name puts into a man's heart. In 1960, a journalist came to Naples to interview me. He wanted the real story of Lucky Luciano. I gave him pieces, enough to make the article sing, but never the whole truth. The whole truth was mine to keep. But after he left, I found myself wondering why I'd agreed to it at all. Maybe part of me wanted to make sure my version of the story was the one that lasted. Then came '61. The year started quiet, but by January I knew something was wrong inside me. The chest pains were coming more often. My doctor warned me again: rest, slow down, take care. But my idea of slowing down was 2 meetings a day instead of 4. On January 26, I had a meeting scheduled with an American film producer. He wanted to make a movie about my life, half truth, half legend. I figured, why not? If they were going to tell my story, I'd rather have a say in it. We met at the Naples airport, and I walked him through my version of the old days, the way I saw it, the way I wanted the world to remember it. We shook hands, and I started to walk away. That's when it hit, sharp, crushing, final. My knees buckled, the world tilted, and I knew I'd cheated 100 bullets, 1,000 knives, a lifetime of enemies. But this one I wasn't walking away from. They say I died before I hit the ground. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's better that way, no slow fade, no hospital bed. Just here 1 minute, gone the next. Like a candle in a room with the window thrown open. They buried me in Naples, thousands of miles from the city I made mine. But I like to think that somewhere in New York, on some rain-slick street lit by neon, someone still says my name and remembers what it meant. Because in the end, that's all a man like me really leaves behind, the story. When word hit the streets that I was gone, it didn't spread like a headline, it spread like a whisper. Whispers move different in our world. They slither through backrooms, across card tables, into the ears of men who don't flinch easy. A name like mine doesn't just vanish without making the air heavier. The first calls went out from Naples to New York, Havana, Marseille. Some pretended to be surprised. Most weren't. Men in my business understand that even the best-run clock winds down. Still, when a man's shadow has been hanging over the streets for decades, his absence leaves space someone's always eager to fill. In the U.S., the news made the papers, but the tone was different depending on who was telling it. The New York Times went with Charles Lucky Luciano, reputed leader of organized crime, dead in Naples. Cold, factual, like they were checking a box. The tabloids couldn't help themselves, they painted me in broad strokes, the immigrant kid who clawed his way to the top, the mastermind of the commission, the exile who never really left the game. They made it sound like something out of a pulp novel. Meanwhile, in certain corners of Manhattan, men were taking quiet inventory. Vito Genovese sat in his chair a little straighter, feeling the ghost of competition lift off his shoulders. Costello, though long since stepped back, probably poured himself a drink and toasted the old days. Meyer Lansky? Meyer didn't say much. That was his way. But I'd bet good money he felt it deep down, because Meyer understood better than anyone that I was part of the foundation we'd built together. And when a foundation cracks, even a little, the whole structure feels it. The younger guys in the rackets saw it differently. To them, I was a legend they'd heard about in backroom stories, a name their uncles spoke with a mix of fear and admiration. Now I was a ghost. And ghosts, well, ghosts can't stop anyone from making moves. But the funny thing about dying is that it doesn't end your influence right away. If you've played the game right, you've planted seeds, contacts, loyalties, debts that keep paying out even after you're in the ground. My networks in Sicily and Marseille kept humming for a while. Shipments still moved. Money still flowed. For months after, there were deals being made in my name, as if I'd just stepped into another room and could walk back in any minute. It wasn't just in the streets. Hollywood came sniffing around almost immediately. They'd been circling my story for years, waiting for me to slip so they could grab it. Now, with me out of the picture, they had free rein to twist it any way they wanted. Some scripts painted me as a ruthless kingpin, others as a tragic anti-hero. All of them missed the truth. But that's how it goes, the truth doesn't sell as well as the myth. In Naples, my funeral drew a crowd that turned heads. Local politicians, Sicilian heavyweights, even a few American faces who risked the trip. They stood around the grave like men checking the weather, trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing now. The priest said his words, the dirt hit the coffin, and I was officially part of the past. But here's the thing, in our world, the past doesn't stay buried. Not really. Stories keep it breathing. In the years that followed, my name became a shorthand in American culture. Politicians used it when they wanted to look tough on crime. Journalists dropped it in articles to give their stories a little extra grit. Young wise guys studied my moves like they were reading scripture, some to copy them, some to try to outdo them. The commission I'd helped set up in '31 still existed in form, but it wasn't the same. The unity I'd forced on those bosses had given way to smaller alliances, shifting loyalties, open grudges. Men like Genovese and Gambino carved their empires with their own style. But the rules they played by, those were mine. The sit-downs, the arbitration, the idea that no one man was bigger than the commission, that was my blueprint. Even when they broke the rules, they were breaking my rules. Culturally, America was changing. The old neighborhoods were thinning out, kids moving to the suburbs, new immigrants speaking new languages. Prohibition was long gone. The rackets had shifted to drugs, gambling, unions. Law enforcement had better tools, more surveillance, more ways to catch you slipping. The mob was adapting, but it was losing some of the romance it had in my day. Back then, we had speakeasies with jazz spilling out into the streets, men in tailored suits trading coded words over glasses of rye. Now it was heroin in alleys, payoffs in parking lots. Less style, more survival. That shift made the old days look even bigger in memory. Guys who'd barely known me started claiming they'd run jobs for me, that they'd been in on some big score with Lucky back in the day. It was all smoke, but nobody was in a hurry to correct them. Being connected to my name, real or imagined, was worth something. I think about that sometimes, from wherever I've landed. I think about how a man spends his life making moves, dodging bullets, counting cash, and in the end what he really leaves behind is the story people tell. I controlled mine as best I could while I was breathing. After that, it was in other hands. Some say I died clean out of the life, just an old man in Italy. Others swear I was still pulling strings right up to my last breath. The truth? Maybe it's somewhere in between. But I'll tell you this, if you can keep people guessing after you're gone, you've done something right. The streets in New York moved on, like they always do. The faces changed, the rackets shifted, but the game stayed the same. Power. Respect. Fear, still the currency that mattered. And every now and then, in the back of a dimly lit club, someone would lean over and say, "Remember Lucky? He would have handled this different." And maybe they were right. In the late 60s, I heard they made a TV special about the mob, and my name got top billing. The host said I'd revolutionized organized crime in America. I smiled at that, wherever I was. Revolutionized. That was a nice way of putting it. I'd just seen a messy, violent business and made it work like a boardroom. That's the legacy. Not just the deals I made or the enemies I buried, but the structure I left behind, the way I turned chaos into order, for a while anyway. That's what outlasted me. That, and the fact that in this world, you can't talk about the history of the mob without saying my name. And maybe that's the best a man like me can hope for. To be remembered. To have his story told, even if it's twisted, even if it's exaggerated. Because in the end, whether they call you a villain or a visionary, they're still talking about you. And in this life, that's as close to immortality as you get. Funny thing about the end of a story, it don't really end. Not for a man like me. You can close the book, throw it on the shelf, but the pages stay warm for a while, like the heat from a just snuffed cigar. The smoke still hangs in the air, and people still breathe it in, even if they don't know where it came from. That's how it is with my name. They talk about me in hushed tones, at card games, in prison yards, in old cafes where the espresso's strong enough to wake the dead. A kid might hear it from his uncle, leaning in with that conspiratorial look, saying, "Let me tell you about Lucky." And maybe it's the real me they're talking about. Or maybe it's some version that never existed, built out of rumors and half-truths. Doesn't matter. In this world, perception always trumps reality. See, I didn't just live through history, I bent it. I took the chaos of the bootleg wars, the street fights, the double crosses, and I put it in a frame. Before me, the mob in America was like a dozen brass bands all playing at once, each one trying to drown out the others. I made it an orchestra. I wrote the sheet music, picked the conductors, and told the horn players when to take a breath. And for a while, it was beautiful in its own twisted way. But even an orchestra can go off-key. That's the nature of men: greed, ambition, ego, they creep back in no matter how clean you try to run things. I knew that. I wasn't naive. I just figured I could buy enough time, enough stability, to keep the blood off the front pages and the cops off our backs. And for a couple decades, it worked. That's my real claim to fame, not the hits, not the rackets organization. Order out of chaos. When I got exiled to Italy, they thought they'd taken me out of the picture. They didn't get it. A man's influence ain't tied to geography. If you've built the right kind of network, your reach stretches across oceans. I had guys in New York who'd jump if I so much as cleared my throat over the phone. The bosses could meet without me in the room, but they knew I was still in the conversation, whether they liked it or not. After I died, the press tried to put me in a neat little box * criminal mastermind, ruthless kingpin, the father of modern organized crime. * They like those titles. They make the story easier to tell. But I wasn't their father, and I wasn't the devil they painted either. I was a businessman in a dirty business. I was a diplomat in a world where most negotiations ended with a bullet. I kept the peace when it suited me, broke it when it didn't. And yeah, I had blood on my hands. No sense pretending otherwise. But it was never about cruelty for cruelty's sake. In my mind, every move I made was a calculation: remove this guy and 10 others can keep earning, spare that guy and maybe he's useful later. Cold? Sure. But in our game, the only other option is chaos. And chaos is bad for business. The younger generation of wise guys today, they operate in a different landscape. Cameras on every corner, phones in every pocket, the feds with toys we couldn't have dreamed of in my day. And yet, some of them still try to run plays out of my old book, sit-downs to settle disputes, cutting the takes so everyone eats, keeping the violence in the shadows. They might not even know those rules came from me, but they did. Like the foundation of a building you can't see anymore, my hands are still in the architecture. The part the public never gets, what no movie ever shows right, is the waiting. Most of my life wasn't shootouts or high-speed chases. It was sitting in dimly lit rooms, nursing a drink, listening more than I talked. Watching men lie to my face and deciding if it was worth calling M on it. The power wasn't in pulling the trigger, it was in making sure you rarely had to. But try telling that to a country that loves its heroes and villains simple and loud. In the American imagination, I'm the guy in the pinstripe suit, cigarette dangling, giving orders with a flick of the wrist. That's fine. Every legend needs its costume. But the truth is, my best weapon was patience. Patience, and the ability to see 3 moves ahead when the other guy was still deciding his opening play. Sometimes I wonder if the life was worth it. If I'd played it straight, maybe I could have been a banker, a politician, some respectable figure shaking hands at ribbon cuttings. But then I remember, those guys were crooks too, just with cleaner collars. And they had bosses, same as I did. The difference is, mine didn't pretend otherwise. The streets I came from didn't give you many choices. You learned to hustle, or you got swallowed whole. I chose to hustle at the highest level I could. And for a while, I sat at the top of the pyramid. From down there on the Lower East Side, looking up at the towers of Manhattan, it seemed impossible. But impossible-less just another word for a job that hasn't been done yet. Now, years after I've gone, America's still fascinated with the mob. They make shows about it, documentaries, podcasts. They write books. And every time they tell the story, I'm somewhere in it, even if it's just a name dropped in passing. That's the thing about building something bigger than yourself, it keeps your shadow in the room long after you've left. And maybe that's the lesson, if there is one. Not how to make money or dodge the law. Not how to run a crew or negotiate with killers. But how to leave something behind that matters even in a crooked world. For me, it was a set of rules that, for better or worse, kept the blood from flooding the streets. For someone else, it might be something entirely different. But the principle's the same: build something that outlasts you. As for me, I can rest easy knowing I played my hand the best I could with the cards I was dealt. I took my shots. I made my enemies. I buried a few of them too. And I never let anyone else write my story while I was alive. After that? Well, like I said, the smoke hangs in the air. People breathe it in. They make of it what they will. If you're listening to this now, maybe you're one of those people. Maybe you're lying in bed, eyes half closed, picturing the glow of street lamps on wet pavement, hearing the muffled jazz from a basement club. Maybe you're wondering if the world I lived in was as dangerous as they say, or maybe you're wondering if it was more. Either way, you're still here, listening. And that means the story's still doing its job. Because in the end, that's all a man like me can hope for, to keep the room quiet enough that when he talks, whether from the grave or across a table, people lean in. And now? Well, you can close the book. The last drink's been poured. The last deal's been made. But don't be surprised if, sometime down the line, you catch a whiff of cigar smoke where there shouldn't be any. Don't be surprised if you feel eyes on you in a crowded room. That's just me, checking in. Making sure the game's still being played the way it ought to be.